Thank you. Good morning. It's my first time speaking at VB, so I'm really, really excited to be here. Thank you to Allison, Helen, all the organizers. Thank you also to the AV team for saving me this morning and getting my slides up on the screen. So topic of today is protecting high-risk communities, and we can just dive in. My name is Runa. I like cats, pizza, and indoor skydiving. If you follow me on social media for a while, you've probably seen a lot of photos that look something like this. It's pretty cool. You go in a wind tunnel. It simulates free fall that you get from skydiving, except you don't actually have to jump out of a plane. I've been doing it a bunch this summer, this year. Really, I could talk about that all day. If you want to talk about it, more than happy to do that later. So not going to do that on stage. I'm originally from Oslo. I've lived in New York City for, I want to say about 8.5 years. I started with the Tor project back in 2009. So I was a summer intern for Tor during Google Summer of Code. And that's really when I got connected with civil society, got connected with different groups of high-risk people, got to see what it means to work with and support these different communities, and then took all of those lessons learned and worked with Freedom of the Press Foundation, and then later spent 3.5 years as the head of security for the newsroom at the New York Times. Then left in late 2019, started 2020 and the pandemic as a consultant. And then in 2022, a friend of mine was like, hey, Runa, you've spent so much time working with and for high-risk people. Why don't you just start your own company? So summer of 22, I started Granitt, which is a consultancy focused on high-risk groups of people, different communities, and trying to help them do their work safely. So what I wanted to focus on today, and what I also wrote in the abstract for this talk, is I sort of asked this question of when you think of protecting activists, journalists, lawyers, and politicians, what comes to mind? So just take 30 seconds. Less than that. But just really think about what does that entail? What does that mean? What comes to mind when you hear this? So for me, back when I started at Tor, 2009, 10, 11, very much APTs. I think that was a lot of what I read about, was a lot of what I heard about. It's a lot of what the community talked about back then, for sure. And so for me, if you had asked me that question back then, I think my answer would have just straight up been APTs. Arab Spring was in the news. Nation-state hacking campaigns was in the news. Internet censorship was in the news. There was just a lot of things that were written about and reported on that really sort of could be summarized at nation-state, APTs, those types of threats. We didn't really talk about any other type of threat affecting these different communities. And so, of course, that would then inform my view on what these communities need. And we love talking about APTs. We still do, right? I thought it was really cool back then. I still think it's really cool today. It is really interesting. It is really juicy. It does make for really cool articles and really fun debates on social media, and certainly really, really good talks. But protecting high-risk communities is so much more than that. And so with this presentation, I really want to encourage you to rethink what the critical threats are for high-risk communities and what the most pressing needs are. And then find ways that you can support these communities regardless of the role that you have today. Because I think as you'll find throughout this presentation is that there are far more pressing needs and far more that you can do that maybe you've thought about today. I can assure you that APTs certainly definitely a valid threat and realistic threat for these communities, but there's a lot more there that we can talk about and that we can help with. So taking a step back then, like what is a high-risk community? I've sort of used that term like a handful of times now. Like what does it actually mean? So back in the start of 2023, the US CISA launched this initiative with a few other countries to look at high-risk community protection. And as part of that effort, they also then came up with this definition of like what is a high-risk community. They tried to make it sort of fairly broad and sort of easy to explain. And so the sort of 3 bullet points that they had for this was 1, history of targeting by APTs, limited capacity for defense, and limited assistance from the US government. And I think the second point is the one that I'm gonna dig in more on today, because certainly APTs, we talked about them a bunch, but limited capacity for defense, I think there's a lot within that one sentence that we can explore. Somewhat related, if you're interested in learning more about what both the UK and the US has done in terms of high-risk community protection, you can check out these 2 websites where they have provided additional guidance and resources to these communities. So last year, when I spoke at MITRE AttackCon, I sort of took CISA's definition for what a high-risk community is, and then I added, or rather sort of built on these additional points. What I've found in my work is, especially working with newsrooms and with reporters, is that the work that they're doing is far more than a 9 to 5. I like to say that if you're a journalist, that is your identity. You're a journalist 24/7. You're a journalist when you're at work using the work computer with your work email to publish something in the work CMS. But you're also a journalist when you're at home on your personal laptop, tweeting from your personal account. And I think that that then becomes really, really important context when we think of how do we then keep that journalist safe in the work that they're doing. We really need to consider more than just corporate assets and systems and accounts and their 9 to 5. We really need to start thinking about how do we protect this individual. The work that they're doing is often like product focused and deadline driven. Certainly if you're a journalist, your work is to talk to people, do research, write articles, publish them, and go back to the beginning. And so as someone who then supports the work that they're doing and tries to help them do this work safely, I really need to also figure out how can I do this in a way that still empowers them to do what they're trying to do, that still has them publish articles and talk to people and click on links and open attachments and do all of this work without slowing them down, without getting in the way. There's also a lot of high expectations around the work that like people sort of in this space are doing, journalists and activists, where I think it's always been the case, like we want to make sure that like what they put out is accurate, it is fair, it is truthful, it's backed by reliable sources. But I think that there's also this like additional component where like if you are publishing an article that you know will upset people, that is also going to change how you prepare for publishing and how you potentially like respond to any criticism that you get. And I think that all of that also then goes into this model of like how do we prepare for the work that we're doing? How do we prepare for actually sharing that with the public? And then finally, these high-risk communities also, in addition to all of this, still deal with sort of like more common threats, adware, malware, potentially ransomware, phishing, different scams, like all the other like sort of quote-unquote common stuff that like we talk about in all sorts of other industries still applies to these communities. So we can't just focus on the APTs. We can't just focus on sophisticated spyware. We also really need to account for like how are we protecting the organization? How are we protecting the individual from quote unquote common threats as well? So over the years, I've sort of like rephrased or reframed my work to sort of thinking about like how my job, my role is to help you do your work safely. And for me, that means solving a puzzle. Because what does safely mean for you? What does safely mean for this team? What does safely mean for this project? What does safely mean for this trip? And for me, figuring that out then becomes this like really, really interesting puzzle of like taking all the tips and tools and strategies that I'm aware of, all the information that is available to me, how do I piece all of that together to be able to define in this context what safely means? And I'll give you an example of this. I will say I did not work on this story. I did not work with the journalists that this article refers to. I've had discussions with people who were familiar with the case after, but just wanted to be very clear about that. So in the fall of 2021, two Norwegian reporters traveled to Qatar to report on migrant workers ahead of the World Cup. At the end of their trip, I mean, they went there, they interviewed some subjects, there were some photos, some videos. I think they did some like live news segments with Norway. And then at the end of the trip, as they were like preparing to like leave the country and go home, they were arrested. They had all their equipment seized. They were held for about 36 hours before they were allowed to go home without any of their equipment. And when they did get the equipment back, I think it's like 6 weeks later, all the material had been deleted. And the journalists did publicly also say that they were concerned about the sources. And I often use this as an example of like the importance of planning your work when I talk to reporters. I'm sure some of you may be familiar with this like idea of like threat modeling, where we talk about these like 5 key questions of what do I want to protect, who might be after it, what resources do they have, how likely is it that they succeed, et cetera, et cetera. I think I often use this as an example and sort of try to then run through like for this specific trip, for this specific story, how do we ensure that they can do that work safely? And I think to sort of like illustrate like safely in this context, think about like 2 people traveling from Norway to Qatar to work on this story. From a physical safety point of view, there would have been a discussion about flights, hotel, maybe a rental car, communications. They had a communications plan in place with the newsroom back in Norway. Like they would have talked about the sort of physical safety and logistics aspects of this trip. I'm sure they also touched on like the legal aspects of the trip, like do we need visas? Can we go in as journalists? Is the work that we're doing here okay? They traveled as a team of 2. There was a communications plan in place, so emotionally, there would also have been like some sort of plan or at least support in place. But then again, if we look at the sort of digital component, the fact that material was seized is one thing, but the fact that the material was later accessible to the authorities and the journalists were then concerned about the sources shows that maybe they hadn't fully accounted for safety in the digital security category. So when I think of like solving puzzles, I think of taking cases like this and really trying to figure out what is it that they're trying to achieve, what could happen, what could go wrong, and how do we either prevent that or how do we potentially mitigate or sort of limit the risk associated with that. I wrote an article early this year with sort of lessons learned. I've found that for newsrooms especially, they're not great at like taking lessons learned, whether internally or from other newsrooms, to try to figure out like what actually happened, what went well and what didn't, and how can we make sure that it doesn't happen again. So I wrote this article. If you want to dig into the sort of the technical nitty-gritty of what could have, should have been done, you can read that there. But to sort of summarize that, like, safely for people, safely for high-risk communities really means accounting for physical, digital, emotional, and legal. There's been a lot of focus in some high-risk communities, especially like within newsrooms over the years, of like physical safety. Like, they're sending people into war zones. Physical safety is incredibly important, and so there's been a lot of discussion then around like how do we keep people safe in this context. There's been a lot of discussion about legal risk associated with journalism. How do we make sure that we don't get sued? What do we do if we do get sued? What do we do if we receive a subpoena for our email? Again, a lot of experience shows that this is something that people need. But I try to really sort of drive home that for high-risk communities, there needs to be a greater focus on all of these buckets, not just a single one. In other words, a holistic approach. And sort of slightly on that note, I also wanted to say that these days, especially in the US, there's a lot of focus on what a second term of Trump could mean for journalists, could mean for activists. And this is sort of one example where like we're talking not just from a legal safety point of view, we're also talking digital security point of view, we're talking physical security point of view, and emotional. Just imagine being like an activist or a journalist covering a protest, like a political protest in the US these days. You do really need to account for safety in all of those categories. If you cover just one, you will absolutely have a gap in your planning process. So, you know, my sort of like favorite answer when I talk to people is that it really depends. Like, you know, someone says, you know, how can I do XYZ safely? And my answer is just that it just really depends on like who you are, what you're doing, where you're from, what your background is, the resources that are available to you, the capacity that you have. And by that I mean time, money, people supporting you, your ability to take in new information, your ability to change your behavior, your ability to learn a new technical tool. So exactly like how we go about supporting these communities just really varies. There was an article that was sort of shared, it made the rounds on social media, I think like pre-pandemic days, titled, "Your threat model is not my threat model," which I think was a really good point. It is really easy to like give guidance that we just think applies to absolutely everyone because it sounds great to us. But as you start working with different like communities, whether high risk or not, you'll find that different people need different things. And that certainly also becomes really important in the context that I work in. So back in, this was like early 2019, back when I was still at the Times, we sort of found that there was a physical safety team, there was corporate communications and HR that would take on some of the sort of emotional support aspect of the work that the newsroom was doing. There was cybersecurity and then legal. And we found over time that like we would all in different ways sort of learn about the challenges and the needs of the journalists. And sometimes legal would hear about something that was like sort of kind of technically a cybersecurity concern, or I would hear about something that was in many ways also a emotional safety concern, potentially a physical safety issue. So we all got together to create a working group for newsroom safety, which I think is now more common across newsrooms, not just in the US, than it perhaps was back in the day. And we really wanted to just like get all of these different stakeholders together to really talk about not just cybersecurity or physical safety or like emotional safety in the context of online threats and harassment, but really look at how do we come together to help these people do their work safely in whatever way we need to do that. But I'm sure you've seen this like CISO mind map before. If you're looking at like the type of work that like a cybersecurity team does at, whether it's a big company like the New York Times or the Washington Post or NPR or BBC, or it's like a smaller organization that maybe has one IT person who's also responsible for security, they do a lot. Like we're talking like security operations, there's risk management, there identity and asset management, there's governance, there's leadership skills. You're managing a team, you have analysts. You may also be dealing with compliance. There may be some regulatory stuff that comes floating your way. There's discussion about budget. Someone wants to use a new Slack bot. You still have to like touch base and circle back and sit in far too many meetings. And then somehow on top of all of this, you need to think about how do we protect the high-risk people within our organization. It's a lot, and it doesn't quite scale. And so it makes total sense that figuring out how to protect high-risk people within your organization is just not going to be at the top of your list. It is a lot of work. Which is sort of the main point here is like, yeah, it's a lot. It doesn't scale, it doesn't work, it's really, really hard to take on. If it's not work you've done before, or you have a lot of experience doing, it is an entirely new space. So what I've then found in terms of like, what do high-risk communities need? Well, they need holistic support. So we talked a lot about that already, right? We really do need to account for threats across physical, digital, emotional, and legal to really talk about how like these people can work safely. So we need holistic support for these communities, but I think even more so, and I think what could be incredibly helpful from like communities like the ones we have here is that the people supporting high-risk communities need support too. I think in my work over the years, certainly when I was like at the Tor Project and Freedom of the Press Foundation and at the New York Times, I got to work directly with quote unquote high-risk people. I got to work directly with activists. I got to work directly with people who were trying to figure out how the internet censorship was being done in Ethiopia back in the day, or how the Great Firewall of China was working back in like 2013, 2014. But in my work over the past 5 years, I think I have spent more time working with people who directly support the high-risk communities or the high-risk individuals than I have interacting with those individuals myself. And I think the work that I then do and the way that I provide guidance changes slightly, because instead of like providing guidance directly to the sort of impacted individual, I need to then first help someone else, being an individual or a team, or maybe even sort of the broader like leadership, understand what the needs are of that individual or that team and what that means for the organization as a whole. Which sort of brings up this question that I'm like, what kind of support is actually helpful? I know that now over the years, there's been more initiatives from industry to support high-risk communities, civil society, to provide more support to NGOs, to do more for the people who don't necessarily have as many resources or don't have the ability to defend themselves the way like Fortune 500s do. But so then there's this question of like, well, what kind of support is actually helpful? So going back to my AttackCon talk from last year, I talked a lot about, in that case, what sophisticated spyware, so Pegasus and Predator, means for us as defenders. And in the context of like report writing, I find that like, yes, you should detail the findings that matter to your stakeholders. So you should still write the report the way that you write it today. And you should like be aware of who's going to read it and the information that they need. But I think it's also worth considering your entire audience. So one example is, if you're writing about if you're writing about sophisticated spyware, right? And maybe you think that, oh, only other threat intel analysts are going to read this report. Only security researchers are going to read this report. It's not really going to like reach a broader audience than that. I would sort of challenge that and say that the people who also now read those reports and read the articles that you write, they're technical journalists that then translate that into news reporting. These are researchers, analysts, people who work with and support high-risk communities. They're the individuals within the high-risk communities themselves, just trying to understand what this spyware thing is about and what they can do about it. They too are looking for guidance, and so of course are going to come and find your reports and try to make sense of it. And so yes, for the reports that you write, there will always be that sort of core initial audience with the stakeholders that you need to meet the needs of, but I very much encourage you to also be aware of your entire audience. I think a lot of people over the years have sort of talked about how do we like write better reports. There are definitely like ways that you can direct different readers with like boxes and headlines and colors and all that sort of fun stuff. One example that I gave in my talk last year is if you read some of the posts that have been published by Citizen Lab, for example, over the years, some of them are very, very long. And there will be like a very lengthy introduction, and there will be a lot of context that has to do with like human rights and geopolitics and what happened when, in what part of the country or in what part of the world. And then there will be like a lot of background about who the victims are, the work that they're doing, what they've done in the past, how they were targeted now. And then we get to the sort of technical nitty-gritty. And I remember having this moment years ago where I was like reading one of these like posts and I was just thinking, this is just too long. There's too much stuff here that I just want the technical stuff at the very end. And for me, sure, I can just scroll to the very end and get that. But I think at that point, in that moment, I was really stepping over how all of this other stuff is helpful information to other groups of people that also read the work that Citizen Lab is publishing. So that's just to say that there are definitely ways that you can write reports or write articles in a way that provides different information to different readers, and you can like serve multiple stakeholders across the same post, and you can like direct them in different ways with like headlines and colors and all that fun stuff. I think my biggest, I don't want to say complaint, but I'm going to say complaint from last year and certainly also going into this year is that like I read a lot of reports on threats and attacks affecting civil society, affecting high-risk groups of people where like you read about some malware, some implant, some scam, some phishing attempt, some type of sophisticated what have you, and you get all the technical nitty-gritty and you get the IDA screenshots and it looks really, really cool, and then you get to the bottom and then there's no advice. We just sort of like leave it hanging there. So it's like, okay, yeah, we have targeting in this way, does this thing on the device, then what? What do I do with that? If I am someone who's supporting high-risk communities, I am coming to you to try to understand what was this attack about, what happened, what did it look like, what occurred, what was the impact to the individual. I get to the bottom of that page and I go, okay, then what? What do I do? What is my takeaway? What do I tell the people that I am working with? So please do include advice for the people who are reading your posts and your articles, and like what do they do with the information that you're presenting? And it could be that the thing that they should do is just update your systems, install the latest version of iOS, turn on two-factor. It could be that the guidance is that simple. It could also be that currently, unfortunately, we don't know how to effectively defend against this type of threat. That is also a takeaway. But I encourage you to at least put something there for the people who are coming to you for this type of guidance. I'll also say, like, you should convince people to allow you to include mitigations by other vendors. If you're Google and you're writing a post on iOS 0 days targeting some politician in some country to install something that is potentially Pegasus or at least something like it, and you do not at the end of the post say turn on lockdown mode on iOS to defend against this specific attack, you are doing the community a huge disservice. I don't quite understand why vendors sometimes just don't include mitigations by other vendors. Because again, the people who read these reports are not just the researchers and the analysts and the CISOs and the people who can understand the technical nitty-gritty. The people who read these posts are also the journalists, the activists, and people like me just trying to understand exactly what happened and how do I now take that and translate that and give that to the people that I work with. So I wanted to give a shout out to Martijn, who's over there, who after lunch today is going to dive even deeper into the topic of threat intelligence for high-risk communities and sort of take maybe, hopefully, potentially, some of what I've said today to try to like dive a bit deeper into what does this mean for all of you? How can you get more involved? How can you help? What does help actually look like? And we can certainly also dive more deeper into the stuff that I've talked about. I think I'm doing pretty good on time, though. How much time do I have left?
About 10 minutes.
10 minutes. Okay. Because I think it's a really, really sort of important discussion to have. Because over the years, there's been a lot of talk like about, you know, how do we help and what is helpful. And I don't know that there's like a single like answer to what is helpful. There's what sort of I've seen that I know could be helpful for me. I know Martijn will have a lot of good feedback on what he's seen would be helpful for him as well. And so I just really encourage you, if this is a topic that you're interested in, please do come to this talk as well. And I think that is what I had. And so I will pause here. I think certainly if anyone's got any questions, more than happy to take them on stage. If not, I think that we can wrap, and I'd love to talk about all of these things throughout the conference. Thank you.
Okay.